I remember growing up American felt like it was something to be proud of. People, I would say, admired it, and some probably even envied it. When I traveled outside of the USA as a teenager and also through my 20s, I remember how people lit up when they found out, that I was American. It was like this instant curiosity. But today, this feels very different. The reaction has changed. And I keep asking myself, why? Is being American not as cool as it used to be? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So there was a time when America felt like the center of the world. After World War II, the United States wasn't just a powerful country. It became like a symbol of freedom and prosperity. Jazz and rock and roll were spreading everywhere globally, and Hollywood movies were shaping what the world imagined as the American dream. And in the decades that followed after, the influence kept growing. Especially during Cold War, being American meant that you were on the side of democracy and innovation. And fast forward to 1969, the moon landing, which became this global statement. So the US became this leader in technology, in entertainment, in lifestyle trends, and most of the world wanted to be part of that story. So I was reading this article which said that between 1945 and 1980, about 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States, chasing that dream opportunity. And my dad was one of those people. He left India on his own dime after high school, and he paved his own way without knowing the language. He learned the language. He received 2 master's degrees. He became one of those cliche examples of going from nothing and achieving so much. And some immigrants became world icons, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He left Austria with almost nothing, and by the 1980s, he was one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Gloria Estefan is another example that came from Cuba and turned her music into this global phenomenon. And then we have people like Amanpour, who left Iran in the 1970s and went on to become one of the most respected journalists. But it wasn't only the celebrities. Immigrants also built companies that defined American success globally. Intel, for example, is founded by an immigrant. Levi Strauss, an immigrant from Germany, created the brand that turned blue jeans into a global symbol of American style. So the American dream wasn't just a slogan. It created people, it created stories, it created companies that reshaped the world. And somehow I felt that reputation of America personally, because when I traveled years ago, the moment someone found out that I was American, there was this instant curiosity. There were questions, there were smiles, sometimes even admiration. Being American back then wasn't neutral, it had this cool factor, and it carried weight. Somewhere along the way, the shine started to fade. The way people looked at America began to shift. By the late 20th century, admiration was still there, but it was becoming complicated. During the Vietnam War, for example, images of bombings, the protests, which were broadcasted worldwide. And for the first time, America's role as the good guy in global conflicts wasn't taken for granted. The Cold War framed the US as the champion of democracy, but also as a country willing to intervene anywhere to protect its interest. And then came the 80s and the 90s, when globalization and American corporations started spreading everywhere. Some loved it, but others saw it as a cultural dominance. Brands like McDonald's, like Coca-Cola, became symbols of what critics called it Americanization. And then 9/11 happened. And this is where I feel like the American image starts to crumble even further. The wars that followed after 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq turned much of that sympathy into resentment. And I remember in 2003, millions of people in cities like London, Berlin, Sydney protested against the US invasion of Iraq. So the favorable views of the US dropped across Europe and the Middle East. You reap what you sow, and that's exactly what started to happen to the US. And then at the same time, there were all these domestic issues that started surfacing for the world to see. They became the global talking points. One of the biggest examples is healthcare. For decades, the US was the only wealthy country without universal healthcare. And at first, that fact wasn't front and center. And the world didn't really know about it or didn't know how bad it really was. And later, how social media expanded, it became impossible for America to hide the truth. News stories about medical bankruptcies, expensive prescription drugs, debates over basic coverage started making headlines abroad. So as the world started witnessing all of this, this started to become the symbol of America's inequality. The richest country in the world, where millions couldn't afford to see a doctor. So obviously people started to think, maybe America is not as wonderful and perfect as I thought it was. There were other issues too, like gun violence in schools, growing political division, racism. So for many, America stopped being that role model to aspire to, and it started becoming a country that symbolized excess, instability, and dysfunction. And I felt that shift firsthand when traveling. Within my own friend circle in Europe, now I hear this statement more often than ever before, that America is crazy. There's some truth to it. This country is crazy. America is still powerful, it's still influential, but the perception has changed. It doesn't always carry the same cool factor that it once did. So now the big question is, what changed? What happened? Why did the image of America shift from being admired to being questioned? A big part of this, I think, is that the rest of the world caught up. In the 80s, for example, Japan became known for cars, for electronics, for design, and suddenly it became a rival to America. At the same time, Europe was refining its own cultural identity, promoting not just history, also promoting lifestyle that felt sophisticated and balanced. And that perception is still carried through today of Europe. And by the 2000s, South Korea started exporting K-pop, film, technology, which started shaping global youth culture in so many ways that how America used to do. And then of course we have China, the China economic rise, which changed everything. So therefore, this idea that one country being the center of global cultural and power doesn't fit anymore. And at the same time, the US started becoming the big red flag of contradictions that you just cannot ignore anymore. US had this polished image because of Hollywood, but alongside there was always this inequality, political division, and violence. And then came the rise of social media, the fire that burned through America's polished image. I think this was basically the start of the end of America. For decades, the propaganda and carefully curated media shaped how the world saw the US. But then we got introduced to platforms like YouTube, like Facebook, like TikTok, and it started giving people access to this unfiltered, immediate news. Videos started to circulate that showed the side of America, which was rarely seen in those glossy magazines and Hollywood movies. Homeless camps in major cities, families going bankrupt over medical bills, and streets filled with people struggling with drugs. So suddenly, self-proclaimed best country in the world was being compared to the very places that it once looked down upon. I remember when my parents moved back to the US, I was about 8 years old. The most common question that I got from Americans was, do you guys have bathrooms in India? And I used to think, are people really that ignorant? But that's the power of propaganda. The US fooled the world and has also fooled its own citizens. But social media changed all of that. It stripped away the polished image, not just for the rest of the world, but also for the Americans themselves. The richest nation on earth, and yet millions are sleeping on the street. Millions are going hungry or living without basic health care. Social media shattered the myth and replaced it with something raw, something closer to reality. So America no longer has its monopoly on aspiration. So what changed? In short, the answer is the world diversified. Power, culture, influence became multi-centered. America, I think it's still huge, it's still influential, but it's no longer the only story that people want to be a part of. So I felt this shift in perception on a very personal level. If you are new here, I live between the US and Europe, and that somehow gives me this double vision. In America, there's still pride in innovation. People, celebrate the hustle culture, the big dreams, the big idea, that you can reinvent yourself at any point in your life. But when I'm in Europe, I hear a different story. People often point to the problems. So to my European friends, the idea that the richest country in the world has millions without basic security doesn't really make sense. And I'll never forget the moment when I was traveling through Germany and I met someone new for the first time. Their first reaction wasn't about, let's talk about New York or Hollywood or whatever. It was a very blunt question. How do you live in a country with so many school shootings? And that question still lives rent-free in my head. But even with all this negativity, there's this one positive that almost always comes up. No matter the criticism, people still say the same thing to me, that Americans are some of the nicest and the friendliest people that they've ever met. So I'm caught in between. On one hand, I know the best of America, the energy, the drive, the diversity. It's unlike really anywhere else. But on the other hand, I can't deny the things that I've seen and experienced that line up with those criticisms. It's like a strange feeling. It's almost like being proud and uncomfortable all at the same time. But what's clear to me now is that being American isn't the same thing anymore. So maybe the question isn't whether being American is still cool. Maybe the question is what it even means anymore. The truth is that America still carries influence. Its culture, technology, creativity, it still reaches pretty much every corner of the world. But the days when the US was admired without question are gone. Now the image of the US is shaped with complexity, admiration mixed with criticism, curiosity mixed with doubt. And I don't think that's such a bad thing, because for Americans, it's a reminder that identity isn't just about slogans or power or the American flag. It's about how we live, how we treat people, and whether our values line up with our actions. So for the rest of the world, it's a reminder that no country is perfect, not even the ones that once set the standard. Ultimately, the question is being American as cool as it used to be? And the answer, I believe, is no, it's not. But maybe cool isn't the point anymore. Maybe it's about redefining what it means to belong to a country. Finding pride in good, facing the flaws honestly, and still holding on to the belief that things can get better. At the end of the day, America is still an experiment, and the world is watching to see how we write the next chapter.